Somewhere out past Jupiter, orbiting a giant ringed planet that most of us only ever picture in photographs, there's a small moon barely wider than the state of Arizona. It is bright white, almost blindingly reflective, and colder than almost anywhere else humans have ever measured, sitting at a surface temperature of roughly negative 330 degrees Fahrenheit. And underneath its frozen shell, scientists now believe, sits an entire ocean of liquid salt water. Not a puddle, not a pocket. A global ocean wrapped around the whole moon like a second skin, hidden beneath an icy crust that in places is thought to be many miles thick. That moon is called Enceladus, and over the past year, several separate teams of researchers, working independently, using different methods and different instruments, have all arrived at versions of the same striking conclusion. This little moon may have almost everything required for life, not proof of life. Nobody studying this data is claiming that, but the list of necessary ingredients keeps getting longer, and the arguments for why those ingredients could not possibly combine into something living keep getting shorter and harder to defend. Here is how we even got here. Because the story of Enceladus is really a story about a spacecraft that found something nobody expected and a moon that nobody thought was interesting. In 2005, NASA's Cassini spacecraft was quietly orbiting Saturn, methodically working through its long list of scientific objectives when it noticed something that immediately changed how everyone thought about this particular moon. Enceladus, this tiny, icy world that scientists had mostly assumed was geologically dead, frozen solid and inactive since the early solar system, was venting. Huge plumes of water vapor and ice grains were erupting out of cracks near its south pole and spraying hundreds of miles out into space, visible even in Cassini's cameras from a significant distance away. Those cracks running across the south polar region even earned their own nickname, the Tiger Stripes, because of how they looked, scored across the pale ice like claw marks. Cassini went on to fly directly through those plumes more than a dozen separate times before its mission finally ended in 2017. And every single time it did, its onboard instruments effectively tasted what was inside that spray, sampling material coming directly from the hidden ocean below. What Cassini found was not simple water ice, and that is really the detail that turned Enceladus from a footnote into one of the most closely watched objects in the solar system. It found salts dissolved in the water, consistent with an ocean in direct contact with rock. It found ammonia, which acts like a kind of natural antifreeze, helping keep water liquid at temperatures that would otherwise freeze it solid. It found methane, hydrogen, sodium, potassium, chlorine, and carbonate-containing compounds. And critically, it found organic molecules, the carbon-based building blocks that, on Earth, are involved in absolutely every living thing we have ever studied, from the simplest microbe to a blue whale. For years afterward, scientists kept returning again and again to that same archived Cassini data, because even though the spacecraft itself was gone, deliberately destroyed in Saturn's atmosphere in 2017 specifically to avoid any risk of contaminating, Enceladus with Earth microbes, the information it had gathered over more than a decade, was still sitting there in archives, waiting to be re-examined with newer techniques, sharper instruments, and better questions. That ongoing re-examination is exactly what has produced the recent wave of findings that has brought Enceladus back into the spotlight. The first major piece of this recent story involves a molecule that sounds alarming out of context, but means something very different to a chemist studying the origin of life. Researchers went back through the plume data, specifically looking for hydrogen cyanide, and they found strong confirmation that it is present. To an origin of life chemist, hydrogen cyanide is treated almost like a master key. It is one of the most chemically versatile starting molecules available for building amino acids, the components proteins are made from, and for building the nucleobases that make up genetic material like RNA and DNA. Finding strong confirmation of hydrogen cyanide at Enceladus meant this moon was not simply carrying a few scattered, disconnected organic fragments drifting in its ocean. It was carrying one of the specific molecules that many researchers believe helped jumpstart the earliest chemistry on the young Earth, billions of years ago, before life here existed in any form. The same body of research also uncovered evidence pointing toward a much larger and more energetic source of internal chemical fuel inside Enceladus than scientists had previously estimated, published in the journal Nature Astronomy. That distinction matters more than it might sound. Having interesting molecules present is one thing. Having enough usable energy available to actually drive ongoing chemical reactions, rather than everything simply sitting inert and unchanging, is what separates an ocean that merely contains the right ingredients from an ocean that could plausibly sustain something like metabolism over long stretches of time. As one of the researchers involved put it, the findings offer further evidence that Enceladus hosts some of the most important molecules for both creating the building blocks of life and for sustaining that life through the kind of chemical reactions living things actually depend on. The second piece of this story is newer, and in some ways even stranger once you understand exactly what the researchers were doing. A team based in Berlin went back to a very specific archived Cassini sample, one that had been largely overlooked in earlier research because most prior analysis of Enceladus's organic chemistry had focused on particles collected from Saturn's E ring instead, the broad, faint outer ring that Enceladus itself continuously replenishes through its ongoing plume activity. Sampling material from the E ring works reasonably well for broad chemical surveys, but it is fundamentally indirect, a bit like trying to understand exactly what fell as fresh rain by testing water that has already been sitting collected in a lake for months or years, mixing and settling the whole time. This time, the researchers deliberately went back to a sample of fresher plume material, collected closer to the actual source at Enceladus's south pole rather than from the diffuse ring further out. What they confirmed in that fresher sample was the presence of the key elements scientists commonly refer to using the shorthand CH-NOPs, meaning carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, the basic elemental toolkit that every known form of life on Earth is fundamentally built from. In this particular sample, they found essentially the entire toolkit, missing only sulfur, along with an abundance of hydrogen gas. That hydrogen detail carries enormous weight on its own because here on Earth, hydrogen escaping from deep-sea hydrothermal vents is exactly what powers entire ecosystems of microbial life living at the bottom of our oceans. Organisms that exist in complete darkness, thousands of feet below any sunlight, that never need light at all because they run their metabolism on chemical energy instead. If Enceladus genuinely has both the elemental building blocks and a comparable hydrogen-based energy source available at the same time, then the two basic conditions scientists look for whenever they assess whether any environment could plausibly support life, meaning the raw chemical materials on one hand and an available energy source to actually use them on the other, both appear to be present simultaneously in the same hidden ocean. Then came a third, quieter piece of this puzzle, and this one did not come from a spacecraft at all because there currently is no spacecraft out there to send. It came instead from a laboratory built jointly by researchers in Japan and Germany who set out to answer a very specific and very old open question. Cassini had already found organic molecules inside the plumes years earlier, but nobody studying that data could be entirely certain where those molecules had actually come from. Were they being actively produced inside Enceladus right now as an ongoing chemical process happening today, or were they simply ancient leftovers, baked into the ice back when the moon originally formed billions of years ago, just quietly along for the ride ever since with nothing new being generated? To try to settle that question, the research team built a small, specialized high-pressure reactor specifically designed to physically recreate the conditions believed to exist inside Enceladus's hidden ocean. Saturn's powerful gravity constantly flexes and squeezes this small moon as it travels along its orbit, a process scientists call tidal heating, and that repeated squeezing is thought to generate enough internal heat to drive hydrothermal activity along the ocean floor, broadly similar in spirit to the hydrothermal vents already well studied on Earth's own seabed. So the researchers mixed together an artificial version of Enceladus's ocean water, based closely on everything Cassini had already measured out at Saturn, and then ran that mixture through repeated cycles of heating followed by cryogenic freezing inside their reactor, deliberately mimicking the kind of tidals squeezing the real moon experiences over and over across its orbit. Afterward, they analyzed exactly what came out of that reactor, using a specialized laser-based mass spectrometer, one specifically built to mimic the instrument Cassini itself had carried, so that the eventual comparison between lab results and spacecraft data would be as close to a direct apples-to-apples match as realistically possible. The results, published quietly in the journal Icarus in January without a great deal of public fanfare, are genuinely remarkable once you actually sit with what they show. The artificial ocean water produced amino acids. It produced aldehydes and nitriles, both important classes of organic compounds. The freezing portion of each cycle alone was enough on its own to produce simpler organic molecules as well, including glycine, one of the most basic and fundamental amino acids known. And when the research team compared everything that came out of their laboratory reactor against what Cassini had actually detected out at Saturn more than a decade earlier, the overall match was strikingly close. In other words, this experiment suggests you do not necessarily need billions of years of ancient inherited chemistry left over from the moon's formation in order to explain what scientists currently find inside Enceladus's ocean. Ordinary, straightforward physics, meaning Saturn's gravity repeatedly squeezing the moon, heat cycling steadily through its rocky interior, and plain seawater chemistry simply running its natural course, appears to be entirely sufficient on its own to keep continuously manufacturing these organic molecules today as an ongoing active process rather than as a one-time relic frozen in place since the moon's birth. That certainly does not mean this particular puzzle is finished. and the scientists involved have been careful and consistent about saying exactly that. Some of the larger, more chemically complex organic molecules that Cassini originally detected out at Saturn still did not appear in the laboratory reactor experiment, even after repeated testing. That gap means either there are additional chemical pathways happening deep inside Enceladus that scientists have not yet successfully identified or reproduced, or alternatively, at least some portion of that more complex material really is ancient after all, inherited from whatever original mixture of ice and rock the moon initially formed from billions of years ago. The lead researcher on that laboratory study was careful to frame the overall result in exactly those terms, explaining that the work sharpens how future plume measurements from any new mission should ultimately be interpreted, and underscores just how important it will be for any future spacecraft to carry instruments specifically capable of directly verifying individual amino acids, and clearly resolving whether the more complex organics found at Enceladus reflect ongoing internal chemistry happening right now, or ancient material that has simply been carried along unchanged since the moon's earliest history. And that, honestly, is the real complicated, unresolved shape of where this entire story currently stands. Nobody involved in any of these separate studies is claiming that Enceladus has life. What they are saying instead, carefully, repeatedly, and consistently across multiple independent research groups, is that Enceladus keeps quietly checking off the basic scientific requirements for habitability, one item at a time. A global subsurface liquid ocean, confirmed through multiple independent lines of evidence. A source of chemical energy, strong enough to potentially sustain something resembling metabolism, confirmed. The full elemental toolkit that life, as we understand it, fundamentally depends on, essentially all present, missing only one element in this particular fresh sample. And organic molecules, some of them apparently forming continuously through ordinary, ongoing geological activity, rather than simply sitting around unchanged as ancient debris from billions of years ago. As NASA's own scientists have publicly stated, none of this guarantees that anyone will ever actually find life at Enceladus. But it is, in the words of one researcher directly involved in the hydrogen cyanide findings, further evidence that Enceladus hosts some of the most important molecules for both creating the fundamental building blocks of life and for sustaining that life afterward through the kind of ongoing chemical reactions that living organisms actually run on. There's a deeper, harder question sitting underneath all of this specific chemistry, one that scientists studying Enceladus discuss quite openly, largely because nobody currently has anything close to a confident answer. It is the question of whether the jump from merely interesting prebiotic chemistry into actual functioning biology is something that tends to happen relatively easily, almost automatically, whenever the right basic conditions happen to line up somewhere in the universe, or whether that jump is instead astonishingly rare. So genuinely rare that an entire small moon could have every single necessary ingredient sitting patiently in place for literally billions of years and still never once crossed that particular line into life. Enceladus, small and unassuming as it is, has effectively become one of the very best real-world laboratories available anywhere for eventually answering that exact question. Largely because, unlike some distant exoplanet that we can only ever study indirectly through a telescope light years away, Enceladus happens to be close enough that an actual spacecraft can fly directly through material erupting from its hidden ocean and sample it firsthand. There's also a genuinely elegant, almost convenient detail buried inside how scientists think we could eventually test for life there without ever needing to physically land on the moon or drill down through miles of solid ice. Because, in a very real sense, Enceladus is already doing the hard excavation work entirely on its own. Every single time it vents through those south polar tiger stripes, it is actively flinging a fresh sample of its own subsurface ocean directly out into open space in the form of countless tiny ice grains that a passing spacecraft could simply fly straight through and collect, no drilling required. Researchers working separately on detection methods have already demonstrated that modern mass spectrometry instruments are now sensitive enough, at least in principle, to identify the distinct chemical signature of even a single bacterial cell, if one happened to be trapped inside one of those individual ice grains. That particular finding is not technically a discovery about Enceladus itself, but it matters enormously for the moon's future, because it suggests Enceladus may not require an enormously expensive, complicated landing mission in order to get a genuinely meaningful answer. A well-instrumented flyby spacecraft, deliberately designed to repeatedly fly directly through those plumes and analyze the material with far sharper, more sensitive instruments than Cassini ever carried, could potentially settle a question that has technically remained open ever since 2005. No such mission is currently on its way to Saturn. Cassini itself is long gone, and everything described here, every single one of these recent findings, has come entirely from scientists returning again and again to data that spacecraft originally collected years earlier, squeezing meaningful new insight out of old measurements using sharper instruments. better laboratory techniques, and more carefully targeted questions than were available the first time around. That alone tells you something important about how much scientific value is likely still sitting untapped inside data we already have safely archived, and how much more there almost certainly remains to learn whenever a genuinely new spacecraft is eventually designed, funded, built, and sent back out toward Saturn. For now, this small, blindingly white moon simply keeps doing what it has apparently been quietly doing for a very long time, continuously venting a piece of its hidden ocean out into the cold darkness surrounding Saturn, entirely indifferent to whether anyone back on Earth happens to be paying attention at any given moment. The plumes do not pause to wait for funding decisions or new missions. The underlying chemistry inside that ocean does not stop simply because we have not yet caught up to it. Whatever genuinely is or is not happening inside that lightless, high-pressure water, sealed away for who knows how long beneath miles of solid ice, has apparently been quietly unfolding for a very long time already. And it will almost certainly keep unfolding exactly the same way whether or not humanity ever manages to get the full answer it is looking for.